By pulling a circular plate across the surface of a pool of water just so, we can create a wavefront that will be visible as a pair of self-motivating, spiraling vortices at either end of it. These vortices are visible here because their spiraling the water's clear surface makes it act like a focusing lens. This model for creating a wavefront, and consequently the pair of vortices that appear at either end of it, only requires a puddle, pool, or pond, and a plate, or a paddle or oar. The twin vortices will continue on indefinitely, barring wind interference, depending on the dimensions and shape of the puddle, pond, or pool they are confined to, and the pattern of the wavefront, including the nature of the vortices perpendicular to it at either end, is alterable by changing the shape or dimensions of the paddle or plate. So what we are going to be looking at in the remainder of this section of this lecture video will be an experiment that can be replicated by anyone with access to a pool of water and a paddle or plate with which to stir it up. This should satisfy the Newtonian era conditioning that stipulates that what Einstein called a mental experiment must have a physically demonstrable component based upon a replicable experimental model. To make the models we will be showing in this section, all one would need would be a pool, a plate, and, if the water is clear enough, food coloring dyes. As stated, these vortices will, given a condition without the wind interfering with them, continue on their course, which is determined based on both the shape of the paddle or plate and that of the pool or puddle, for as long as they are able, because the wavefront generated in this way will travel across the entirety of the undisturbed fluid medium. Such a wavefront serves in itself as a model for perpetual motion, because the spirals, as long as provided with a supply of fluid, will otherwise continue on indefinitely. So, basically, with this model of a wavefront dimpled by twin spiraling vortex whirlpools at either end, we are making a measurement of various types of pattern of disturbance to a thermodynamic medium caused by the interference of some object. And so we see this is not unlike the experiments demonstrating Huygens' synchronization, wherein sound waves in a shared medium resulted in plesiochronous synchronization. We can think of the plate, or paddle, as being like the material objects in the Huygens experiments, a pendulum clock, or a metronome, and we can think of the pool, or pond, as being like the medium of the shared surface, allowing all the local objects to fall into one group altogether. If we can use sound waves via a controlled medium to induce synchronization, then we can use waves in a fluid medium to model this, and by studying the wave fronts on water, we can learn more about how sound waves cause synchronization. The pair of vortices counter-rotate. This means one rotates around one direction and the other rotates the opposite direction. The one on the right of the wavefront rotates clockwise, and the one on the left of the wavefront rotates counterclockwise. Yet the twin vortices are, for the duration of their existence, directly relative to one another. The velocity of the whirlpool's spin, for example, is the same in both. The reason for the apparent parity of their spirals is that both whirlpools are opposite diameters of a single tube torus, broken in half by the surface of the water, forming an arc or handle manifold underwater, and causing the twin spiraling whirlpools to remain a single unified wavefront, even along the portion of this current that is entirely submerged. In short, a toroidal patterned vortex of current forms underwater, connecting the spiral whirlpools so that they appear plesiochronous. Just as the whirlpools on the surface are spiral patterns, the current connecting them underwater is rotating in a corkscrew vortex, and both mimic the geometric behaviors of points on the surface of a tube torus 4-manifold. Although we cannot see this toroidal patterned vortex of current below the surface of the clear water with the naked eye naturally, we can ascertain that one whirlpool rotates clockwise, while the opposite, entangled whirlpool rotates counterclockwise, because they are both opposite ends of the same tube, an underwater toroidal vortex of current. To make this current become visible to the naked eye, however, all we must do is add some food coloring, liquid dye, to the surface near the whirlpool's spiral. As the dye is drawn inward by the whirlpool spiraling on the surface current, it is also drawn downward along an arcing vortex line created as the surface current funnels deeper underwater. If we apply colored dye to both whirlpools at either end of the wavefront, we can observe the corkscrewing vortex that forms between them, as the colored dye from each slowly swirls around to connect to the other, forming one half of a tube torus. So we have now seen natural and man-made spirals, toroids, and vortices comprised of terrestrial elements, and implied the same effect may be induced in the cosmic elements as well. So, if we were using this method to model a pair of spiral galaxies, we could posit that such a vortex connecting them might form out of the cosmic element of gravity, or that a similar such vortex might connect the black hole at a spiral galaxy's core to the corresponding poles of each star in that galaxy, or even from each star to its planets, and from each planet to its moons. Such a vortex line curving into a tube torus between twin spirals should be expected to be found most easily in cases where the spirals are clearly oriented relatively to one another, and operant in opposite directions of motion, either clockwise or counterclockwise. However, the presence of an interconnecting pattern, such as a toroidal vortex, formed from the interference pattern arising between two signals, can occur even without these specific conditions. The proposition that a rotating spherical mass can, by its centripetal force, influence the medium surrounding it into a toroidal current is not debatable. Only the presence or absence of a so-called field of ether or zero-point energy as a medium for the transmission of this force can be questioned. As demonstrated using the medium of a whirlpool in water and a ping-pong ball floating more or less stationary on its surface, the reverse of this effect, wherein a vortex preceding the motion of a spherical body may cause a spherical mass to assume a condition of spin along multiple axes of motion, can also occur. So, if a wavefront generated by a larger, older mass interferes with a non-spinning mass, the result is that it will generate spin. So, likewise, if it interferes with a spinning mass, the larger, older wavefront amplifies or impedes the mass's spin. We can see this effect occurring gravitationally, with stars forming a flattened accretion disk around the equator of a rotating black hole, and of planets around the equator of a rotating star. The centripetal gravity of the larger, older mass attracts that of younger, smaller masses toward it. It does this by forming currents in an invisible medium. We call these currents gravity, but modern astrophysicists do not unanimously agree on the nature of the medium through which this force is apparently being transmitted. We can, thus far, only measure gravity indirectly, by its effect on other objects. The only flaw in using the model of wavefronts and whirlpools in a pond or puddle, generated using a plate or paddle, to explain gravitational influences occurring between extremely remote and otherwise apparently unrelated massive objects in deep space is, again, because we cannot say for certain yet that the medium transmitting the force of gravity obeys the same principal laws of thermodynamics as a liquid medium such as terrestrial water. Although the fluid current may be indicative of a force, we cannot say with certainty that this force is exactly like that of gravity. it remains a possibility this current may indicate a cosmic counterpart current occurring between black holes and stars, between stars and planets, etc., but that this cosmic scale current is transmitting multiple forces, not only that of gravity. If we think of the whirlpools as symbolic of spiral galaxies, one rotating clockwise and the other counterclockwise, then there are certain implications from this thought experiment, but these can presently lead us only so far. However, if we think of the whirlpools as symbolic of separate events, apparently unrelated, and the direction of their spiraling currents being opposite one another, as being symbolic of the effect of Huygens synchronization, wherein one or more objects in one of the events would assume the same or very similar rhythm to one or more comparable objects in the other event, then we can find additional levels of symbolic implication. For example, if the medium is thin air, and instead of a toroidal wavefront in water, the transmitter of force is sound waves, then we may immediately find a similarity to Huygens synchronization. In the model of the clocks, or metronomes, for the synchronization effect, we would simply be looking at as many spiraling whirlpool sources as solid objects, and thus just as many currents overlapping and interfering with one another to average out into a single toroidal waveform pattern. In the model of underwater vortices, as in the model of synchronizing clocks or metronomes, any interruption, no matter how small, to the medium through which the waveform is being transmitted immediately terminates the parameters allowing the vortices to cohere or the synchronization effect to persist. If the toroidal waveform touches the wall of the pool, the vortex instantly retracts and dissipates. This remains the case whether the underwater vortex is interrupted by a solid mass, such as the wall of the pool, or by a current of force, such as a secondary vortex. If a younger, faster toroidal wavefront passes through an older, slower toroid inside this fluid medium context, it breaks the bond between the spiral whirlpools forming the toroidal underwater wavefront and causes both whirlpools and vortex to come to an abrupt end. So, if solid mass objects and currents of force can both break the symmetry pairing between the twin whirlpools in this model, what is the implication of this on comparing this model to Huygens synchronization? Unlike living systems in the animal kingdom, which have free will as to when to fall into or out of a synchronized swarm, models for non-living systems exhibiting synchronization depend on the nature of the medium transmitting a force between them. In the earlier experimental models for synchronization, this medium must be a closed system with a finite limit to itself, a definite border around it, etc. However, what we find in modeling a similar effect using a purely thermodynamic medium instead of a more solid shared surface is that the very boundaries defining the medium as a closed system tend to break apart the conditions necessary for modeling synchronization effect. Thus, when the medium is more solid, it requires it being a closed system, acting as its own independent frame of reference, apart from the influence on it of the ground and its gravity, etc. But when the medium is a purely thermodynamic medium, such as water or air, then any interferences, either solid or other waveforms, tend to disrupt the vortex model. In short, in a solid shared surface to exhibit synchronization, it appears necessary for it to be a closed system in a limited space, etc. But for a thermodynamic medium to exhibit a similar effect, it appears more efficient if in an open system with unlimited open area.